and welcome to another episode of But Is It Gothic? We are your Ghoul Guides. I'm Lauren and this is Mary. And today we have Mary presenting us another case. She will be presenting 3 points for a certain topic or phenomena, and I will be ruling whether or not we can consider it to be, in fact, Gothic. So, Mary, what do you have for us for today?
Okay, so this might be a little bit strange, but please bear with me because I'm going to be arguing that Crossroads are Gothic.
So physical Crossroads, not like the Britney Spears 2000s movie.
Not the Britney Spears 2000 movie, and also not the soap, I think it was popular in the 90s, 2000s, about a hotel. Not that, not those Crossroads. Okay. Physical roads,
physical actual roads that cross.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I mean, interesting choice. But yes, Crossroads. Let's do this. Point 1, hit me. Why are Crossroads Gothic?
Okay, cool. So for my first point, I want to talk about Crossroads and mythology and folklore. So
awesome.
Crossroads are basically spaces that mark an intersection. So it's a physical boundary where two places or two roads meet. And symbolically, yeah, exactly, crossroads. Crossroads. Oh my God. But basically, it's a kind of liminal space and a space that's kind of in between. So in between roads, in between spaces. And it's also a supernatural space that's neither like one thing or the other, and perhaps even in between worlds.
So when we say a liminal space, we do literally mean a space that is like in between time, in between places. You know, strange things can happen there.
Exactly. It's not one road nor the other. It's not one area nor the other. It's in between. And we can then take that on kind of symbolically to talk about, you know, the natural world and the supernatural world, because it encompasses this kind of in-between liminality. Basically, because of this kind of supernatural liminality in folklore and mythology, they're seen as a space outside of natural laws, where supernatural spirits can be contacted, or even perhaps where paranormal events can occur. So yeah, kind of think about it as, you know, being perhaps outside of time, outside of the natural, outside of traditional order, not just transgressing boundaries, but in that kind of in-betweenness where anything could be possible. And
I hate to bring this up because you know how I feel about them. Kind of like the idea of a ley line, like when they cross over.
Yeah. So that connection with the other world, with the dead, and with that beyondness, absolutely, yeah. They are, like I say, that they're not one thing nor the other. They encompass that in betweenness, and also kind of on that kind of subject of the dead. So here in the UK, there was a tradition of burying criminals and people who died by suicide at Crossroads. And this is to mark that these individuals have transgressed natural laws, but also spiritual boundaries. So this is particularly important for people who did die of suicide, because it was considered to be not just a crime, but also a spiritual crime that would damn the individual soul. So they weren't allowed to be buried in churchyards, and specifically they had to be buried at Crossroads. Part of this is because the Crossroads are an in-between space. They're not part of any kind of particular village or anything, but also because in folklore, crossroads were thought to confuse spirits. So if spirits, so again, because the souls are damned, if they do return, they wouldn't know where to go because they're at a crossroads, an intersection. and there's no direct way to get back to their particular village. So just quickly in kind of history, there is archaeological evidence of this tradition that dates back to the Anglo-Saxon period or the early medieval period, whichever label you want to use. But this practice was abolished in the 19th century when we did have like a kind of better awareness or we're starting to get a better awareness of mental health and depression. So this idea of maybe having a space associated with death and the damned is very good. No,
it doesn't really make people feel, feel particularly positive about things. I mean, that's interesting though, because the 19th century is still pretty late. Like, we're still talking about the 1800s and it's still very Christian nation, but an increasingly secularized nation, and we're still using these practices. So that is really interesting, actually.
Absolutely. And if you think about the kind of the increasing spirituality and spiritualism in the 19th century, this idea that souls returning and the souls of the damned potentially wandering, Crossroads are a very fertile space for those kinds of folklore and myths to develop. And there are lots of these kinds of stories in local myths around. And just finally on this kind of my first point about the folklore and the mythology of Crossroads, I want to talk about Western folklore in particular, and Crossroads as a space where you can summon the devil. So if you want to make, if you are looking to make a deal with the devil, and if you want somewhere to summon the devil, go to a crossroads. Because again, that kind of liminal space. I'm not recommending you do this, folks, just disclaimer.
Disclaimer. Faustian acts are not recommended by the Ghoul Guides. We do not recommend deals with the devil.
But if you were to do it, the crossroads would be a very good space to summon a devil. And I'm going to get into this kind of Faustian pact in parts 2 and parts 3. But I just want to quickly mention F.W. Murnau's film Faust. So you might be aware of Murnau through his film Nosferatu, which is his adaptation of Dracula. And in 1926, he also adapted Faust. And like Nosferatu, it's a silent film. And Murnau is a German film director as well, so it is coming from that kind of Germanic tradition, which is where Faust is also born from. And for those of you who don't know, Faust is the story of Mephistopheles, who does a deal with the devil and then set in exchange for his soul. But what's really important about Murnau's adaptation is that this deal happens at a crossroads. So again, capitalizing on that kind of supernatural potentiality of Crossroads and summoning the devil.
Nice. Okay, so we've got folklore, we've got misunderstanding of not misunderstanding burial rites, but burial rites that willfully misunderstand mental health perhaps, and summoning devils. So yeah, pretty gothic so far, but let's keep going. Point 2, what do you have for us?
Okay, so for my second point, I want to take you all back to South America in the 1930s for some Crossroads blues. So I hope you'll enjoy this section. So basically, the supernatural significance and the Gothic potentialities of Crossroads exist across many different cultures and folklore. But I want to focus on, for parts 2 and parts 3, this specifically American tradition. And specifically the legend of Robert Johnson, who, legend goes, sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads of highways 49 and 61 in Mississippi in exchange for his devilish techniques and mastery of the blues. So the blues as a musical genre originates in the Deep South, and it has roots in African American and African traditional music, work songs and spirituals. It's typically characterized as melancholic songs of lamentation, and they often incorporate, melancholic or sad lyrics and themes of enslavement, love, police violence, racial oppression, poverty, floods, farming, gambling, and also devils and magic. So they use the blues scales and a cyclical progression of repeating chords that mirrors and echoes a call and response format of traditional African music. So I just want to emphasize that this music is very much tied to this kind of Black African heritage and folklore. And you can't talk about or appreciate the blues without, just appreciating that it is not white music, but it is absolutely amazing and brilliant. So I guess let's get back to Robert Johnson. So like all good legends, there are many different versions of the kind of Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil legend. And there's also quite a lot of different potential crossroads across the South, and particularly in Mississippi. But basically, it's just a retelling of Faust. So Robert Johnson was an aspiring blues player, and he was also a kind of wandering nomadic figure who traveled across the South playing music. And at the crossroads in Mississippi, he meets or summons the devil, who appears to him in the form of a black man. He gives the devil his guitar, the devil tunes it, plays a few tunes, gives it back in exchange for Johnson's soul, and the rest is history. Johnson goes on to become, a master of the blues. There are haunting recordings, and I think they are haunting, of his songs that were made just before his death. So Johnson died in 1938, and these tracks include Crossroads Blues and Hellhound on My Trail. So he was just 27 when he died, but it's after his death that these kinds of Crossroads legends kind of appeared. And they were actually kind of appropriated from a different association with another blues player. So originally these legends were associated with Tommy Johnson, but I think because of the kind of the lyrics and the songs of Robert Johnson, but also the kind of way that he was rediscovered, these stories were transferred to him. And one theory is that the legend took specifically popular hold in imagination in the 1960s as his music was rediscovered or discovered by white people. So,
that's very Gothic in of itself.
Exactly.
Appropriation.
Exactly. This pattern of discovery, rediscovery, appropriation, is
mythologizing, 100% like myths
tied to this Gothic appropriation. It's part of Johnson's story, it's part of the blues legends, and it's also, I think, important to understand that that theme of appropriation in terms of the blues more generally. So we would not have rock and roll without the blues, and also definitely parts of metal, we wouldn't have that without the blues, and part of it comes from that discovery, rediscovery, and then appropriation, which, like you say, it's incredibly Gothic.
Okay, yeah, I mean that, we talked about this in the Ghoul School episode, like that snowballing effect
exactly,
is definitely present here, and that kind of confusing of origins and reappropriating to fit new narratives is definitely incredibly Gothic, in perhaps ways that we don't always consider. That's very interesting. Okay, I'm buying it so far.
So just before we move on, I just want to look at some of his lyrics.
Awesome.
But again, I would encourage you to go and listen to these, and I'll put some links in the video description for you because they are very haunting. But yeah, so Crossroads Blues that I mentioned before starts, I went to the crossroad, fell down on my knees. I went to the crossroad, fell down on my knees. Ask the Lord above, have mercy now, save poor Bob, if you please. So here you have a kind of, you know, the crossroads as a spiritual and liminal in-between space where the speaker is kind of pleading with God. And there isn't any mention of the devil here, but there is the idea that the speaker is standing at the crossroads, God doesn't answer, human passerbys don't answer. But you can, again, with that kind of Gothic layering of myths that are created after the fact, you can imagine that what if the devil answered? And again, you have that kind of classical call and response structure in the song of traditional African music. And then another song, and this one definitely fueled the kind of speculation of his death, particularly because he died so early and people were wondering why. So Hellhounds on My Trail has the lyrics, and the days keep on worrying me. There's a hellhound on my trail, hellhound on my trail, hellhound on my trail. And then a later verse, you sprinkled hot foot powder around my door, all around my door. You sprinkled hot foot powder all around your daddy's door. So here you have the idea of someone being pursued by this supernatural hellhound. And just think about and remember that kind of hot foot powder as a kind of, you know, traditional folkloric, you know, apotropaic to keep these hellhounds at bay, this kind of mythological thing that you can use to keep hellhounds out and at your door, but they can't get in. And then just finally, Johnson, another of Johnson's songs, Me and the Devil. So this includes the lyrics. When you knocked upon my door and I said, hello, Satan, I believe it's time to go. Me and the devil was walking side by side. Me and the devil was walking side by side. So again, you know,
that one's a little bit more explicit.
A little bit more explicit, yeah. But this idea that the legend around Johnson created after he died, but there's so many kind of symbols and things in his lyrics that help to foster this this mythical, supernatural, Gothic narrative of him.
Okay. All right. So we've got, you know, myth making. We've got, you know, evolution. We've got a creation, kind of reading in between the lines. Okay. Case building. Point 3. What's your final point, Mary?
Okay, so for my final point, I'm going to be totally 100% predictable. I'm gonna talk about supernatural.
What? I did not
I
see this coming.
I know, right? So for those of you unfamiliar with the show, Supernatural is an American Gothic fantasy horror, whatever label you want to call it, TV show that uses Crossroads and Crossroads demons as a kind of narrative device and a recurring plot device as well. So that they appear throughout the seasons. And the show itself follows the Winchester brothers, including Dean. And
you can just see his arm.
His arm. He's there. He's there. Dean and his brother Sam, and also, you know, their gay angel friend, and then later in a film, and they drive around America in a '67 Chevy Impala, and this is basically Team Free Will. But especially in the early seasons of the show, roads are obviously really important, and the idea of a road trip, and so is kind of American, specifically American folklore and mythology. Yeah. And so in season 2 and the 8th episode of season 2, they have an episode called Crossroads Blues. And this episode is set in Mississippi. And if you're thinking, I wonder if it's going to be about Robert Johnson. Yes, it is. So this episode is really interesting. It has kind of two narrative layers that it oscillates between. One set in the 1930s, and then one set in the present day. And they kind of don't really interact that much, but they are connected through the story of Crossroads and deals with the devil. And the kind of the narrative layer that's set in the 1930s, it's intentional that you are meant to read that as Robert Johnson. And you see a man playing guitar, playing the blues. And then in the present day, you have a different man, but specifically a black man who is a famous, well, not a famous painter, but a very talented painter. And then also lots of other people who are similarly, they've got hellhounds on their trail. And as you kind of discover Crossroads and Crossroads demons, you see both Robert Johnson and this black painter, they kind of accept their fate. And the black painter at one moment gives the Winchester boys some goofer dust. So if you think back to Johnson's lyrics,
the hot foot powder,
the hot dust at my door, that's exactly what this is. And it's that kind of use of this kind of definitely not white and specifically black folk tradition to keep out hellhounds. That nothing else will be useful to keep out hellhounds. It's goofer dust or it's nothing. And at one point in the episode, Johnson's song Crossroads Blues comes on. And again, if you're familiar with the show, you know that music is really important, but it's traditionally kind of dad rock, American metal from the 80s, the 70s, Led Zeppelin, all that kind of stuff.
Sons.
Yeah, if you're not familiar generically with music, you might not notice it, but the music throughout this whole episode is all blues. It's all blues, and also, like I say, like it intentionally incorporates Johnson's Crossroads blues as well. So that kind of callback to this traditional American myth of Robert Johnson, the blues player who summoned the devil, it is there. It's intentional, and it's 100% a part of the introduction of Crossroads and Crossroads demons into the narrative world of supernatural. So yeah, like obviously going forwards, we come back to this throughout the seasons, but it's never really as much as tied to that kind of blues and African American tradition as it is in this episode, which is a shame. But I think it just plays into that Gothic narrative of appropriation. So
yeah, it fits kind of with the allegory concept as well. We talked about this in Ghoul School. Allegory is a really important part of Gothic development. And I suppose what perhaps that episode is doing is using the Crossroads tradition as allegory for, racial division in America, for importance of lineage, for the loss of culture, for that, forced assimilation and the loss of power through forced assimilation, which is really interesting because, Crossroads demons are largely, this idea that you make deals with the devil there. It's not a particularly empowering concept necessarily, but this is maybe kind of doing that kind of like contemporary Gothic, empowering the other rather than literally demonizing it, which is interesting. It's a shame that they don't make more of that, but perhaps more shows and text will do in the future.
And I mean, I will say, I think up to a point they do it really well, in that they, in highlighting American myths, that I think this episode is one that they do really well, in foregrounding Robert Johnson, his music, that kind of melancholy lamentation. They get that theme, and obviously both Robert Johnson and the painter end up being dragged to hell by hellhounds. But then going forward, what you have is the Winchester boys add Goofadas to their arsenal, their supernatural arsenal of weapons.
So it like sticks for the
and it
rest of
sticks with
the
them.
show. That's interesting.
But you can't get away from the fact that it's two white boys who have taken on
this
knowledge. And lots of people have talked about race and supernatural, and I will leave it to them to do that. There's lots of really great work being done, and continuing to be done. But I think that it is important that in choosing, and especially so early on, in their second season, that they do choose to foreground this myth, because it is a really important American myth.
Yeah, it's kind of giving it its rightful place in the construction of a national folklore and a national mythology. Okay, all fantastic points, I think, so far. Before I pass my ghoulish judgment as to whether or not this is Gothic, do you have any concluding statements, Mary?
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, I think I've made a pretty good case. But to sum up, Crossroads are incredibly Gothic. They are liminal, supernatural spaces tied to folk traditions and filled with Gothic appropriation. And if you're not careful, they're also a space where you might just meet the devil.
Okay. What I have found really fascinating, and I think this is, probably the biggest tick in the box of yes, it is Gothic, is that what you're kind of saying is that essentially this lineage, this heritage, this multifaceted folklore, this blending of cultures, what it essentially gives is potentiality. So that liminality equals potentiality. And I think, potential is such a powerful trope in the Gothic, the potential for something to happen. And, it's not saying you are definitely going to meet the devil at the crossroads. You are definitely going to meet the souls of the dead at the crossroads. It's the fact that you might, like, this might happen. And I think actually that like really stands out to me, because that makes it so much scarier, right?
I mean, it's a fantastic liminal space that's in between, and like you say, it's neither here nor there. It's not that you will, and it's not that you won't, but neither of those possibilities are 100% assured. And you are stuck in this space that has so many potentialities.
I think that is I think that kind of gives it that really powerful mythology, where it's like, oh no, it's not that this place is definitely haunted, or if you cross into this place you will definitely be cursed. It's like, well, you might not, you might never see it, you might see it, like, you just don't know. And I think that makes it so effective as a concept and a trope. So I think, yes, Crossroads are definitely Gothic. You have, the meta aspects of it, that you've got appropriation of mythology, you've got blending of, pre-Christian, Christian, of European, of African, of American. You've got the creation of nation, the creation of mythology. Then you've got, the idea of liminality, of curses, of demons and devils and the supernatural, and of human fallibility. That is something that we kind of take for granted when we're talking about the Gothic, but so often what the Gothic actually is about is human beings being fallible, and what tempts a human being and what corrupts a human being is so central to Gothic texts. Because really what they're about is not, be afraid of the devil, but be afraid of what people are willing to do, and the levels people are willing to go to achieve what they want.
I mean, that's the whole thing about deals with the devil in the first place, is that you have to summon them, and then you have to consent to a deal. Faust, and Faust isn't forced to do a deal with Mephistopheles, and it's the same with Crossroads demons.
Faust
you
really
don't have to.
Faust isn't really caught out by the fact he makes a deal with the devil. he's caught up by his own arrogance, that he thinks that he can like outwit, and that he thinks that he knows more. Like, you know, he thinks that he and Mephistopheles are on a level, and then he's, you know, that's very much not the case, and that's very much what happens in texts like the Monk as well. So yes, Crossroads are Gothic. I have run, so it shall be.
Lauren has spoken, thus it is true.
Spoken. Thus it is true. I am the Ghoul Guide. Okay, well, thank you, Mary. That was an excellent argument. Really fascinating, as well as, of course, well made. And I'm totally not biased when I say that. So this has been another But Is It Gothic? We have been your Ghoul Guides. And in the meantime, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.